So I just would like to welcome you. Please find your seats, and I would like to say find your comfortable seats, but I don't think this is a subject matter that makes for comfort. But it's certainly most necessary and stimulating. So I know most of you, and it is a pleasure to see your beautiful faces shining back. My name, in case if I did not introduce myself, my name is Rabbi Tina Grimberg. I'm honored to serve this community for a number of years. And it is warmest welcome to all of you. This community is dedicated to meaningful Jewish practices, progressive ideas, commitment to Jewish community, humanity in our Reconstructionist values and traditional Judaism. So I would like just to start with a short personal remark, and that is I felt silenced a few times in my Jewish life. One is from not knowing and fear, and another is from knowing but in disbelief. Anti-Semitic attacks done in public on the streets of Soviet Kiev were quite common. Stunned silence, my grandmother and I would retreat into ourselves, and it followed by my plea of her never to speak Yiddish again in public. It took decades to work through this shame and guilt. However, in the new democratic North American world, Jews felt secure, proud, and vocal about their Jewish identities. They lived open, proud Jewish lives. However, October 7th, many of us felt silenced again. In a different way so. This silence was from shock and disbelief that cruelty, barbarism, and its celebration can also spill on the streets of North America. This ugly anti-Semitic disease spread fast and infected seemed to be very fragile North American mind. I'm not only speaking for myself, but based on this deep sorrow, gasping for air, my fellow Jews filled my office with stories, thoughts, and tears. The wonderful thing about North America is that it does not have to be decades to find our voice again, to give, to help, to find clarity. I'm honored to welcome Mark Sandler, whose work does aid, support, and reinforce the necessity of speech that is adequate, elegant, and honest. Welcome. And it is my pleasure to ask Lisa Cherendov, a friend, past president, a board member, and a dear friend to Mark, to come forward for introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you all for being here tonight, and those of you who are here on Zoom. I'm so relieved that we have a nice-sized crowd for Mark tonight. As the rabbi said, I am Lisa Cherendov. I am a member of the board of directors of Darchei Noam. A few months ago, the board devoted an entire board meeting to a discussion of our life as a congregation post-October 7th. We spent time sharing our personal worries and feelings and aspirations for Israel, for the Jewish community, and for our congregation. We knew that we wanted to open up more opportunities for our synagogue to learn together, to share, and to listen to each other on many topics relevant to post-October 7th in a manner consistent with our values and in ways that honor the diversity within our congregation. One of the topics that bubbled up that evening was anti-Semitism. And during that part of the discussion, I said, I have a guy. Mark Sandler is that guy. I'm sure that you all read the announcement of this program, and when you did so, you learned that Mark is highly accomplished. He is widely recognized as one of Canada's leading criminal defense lawyers. He has numerous honors and accolades. He has served as counsel or senior advisor for more than 20 public inquiries or systemic reviews. He is formerly a member of the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. He has appeared before the Supreme Court of Canada on issues relating to hate propaganda and hate-motivated crime. And this past year, Mark founded the Alliance for Canadians Combating Antisemitism, and he's going to speak about that work, amongst other things, this evening. Well, we know all of this is wonderful. He's a very accomplished speaker. But I got a few little tidbits of things that maybe you don't know. Uh-oh, says Mark. The reason that Mark is my guy is that I've known him since high school. He directed me in several theater productions. We were on theater staff together, directing plays at summer camp, and we formed a fast and lasting friendship. Mark stood out. He was really smart. So smart that I'm confident enough now to admit to needing to check a dictionary or encyclopedia once or twice after we had lengthy conversations. What I really need you to know is that in addition to his wonderful CV, which is so long it would qualify just by basis of length for inclusion in my book club, Mark is a wonderful person. He's known in the legal community for his integrity and his ethics and his kindness. He is devoted to his beautiful family. He is an accomplished pianist. He loves theater, musical theater, and I dare say, he has never met a piece of corny theatrical shtick that he didn't love. True. Recently, he's taken up magic. Well, one thing is not magic. Mark's work on the Alliance of Canadians Combating Antisemitism, his accomplishments to date in this initiative are not magic. This work is the result of hours and hours of many late, and I hear sleepless nights, and of a burning desire to do something to effectively address anti-Semitism in Canada, wherever it takes place. So I ask you all to warmly welcome my friend, I hope still, Mark Sandler.
Wow, that was a very generous introduction. I even can't wait to hear what I have to say. I should tell you, digressing a little bit, that as you heard, Lisa and I were drama directors together at a summer camp, and we both went into the dramatic arts. She as an actress, amongst other things. I as a criminal lawyer. And the only difference between our involvement in the dramatic arts is that if I put on a poor performance, someone went to jail. So the stakes were a little bit higher for me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing. I actually don't like talking about myself too often, though I don't mind if others do. But I want to give you some context for why it is that I'm here, and then tell you a little bit about what it is that we're confronting. But hopefully leave lots of time for questions. And I know this is a diverse congregation with very different perspectives, and that's just fine, because I speak to many people who vehemently disagree with what it is that I say, and I'm delighted to speak with them nonetheless, because a very key component of the work that I'm doing is building respectful dialogue amongst people who otherwise would not be speaking to each other. So I have one basic rule, and that is I will speak to anyone who doesn't seek my extermination or the extermination of Israel or its people. It's a pretty low bar to have to overcome in order to speak with me. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. So shortly after October the 7th, I was inspired by the law students at the University of Ottawa. The Muslim and Jewish Law Students Association issued a joint statement. And in their joint statement, they said that there is more that brings us together than separates us. And we want people to know that both of our communities are hurting. And we want our professors to be sensitive to the hurt that both of our communities are feeling. And we want people to know that we're against all forms of hatred, whether it's anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or what have you. For me, this was a powerful statement. For me, this was an unprecedented statement, particularly in the aftermath of October the 7th. And as a result of that, I spoke to those students. I continue to speak to them regularly. And it caused me to commence a national respectful dialogue in the law community to try to mirror the message that these students were conveying. And it was a very simple initiative. And the initiative is this, that basically we support respectful dialogue or civil discourse amongst people as long as those people don't demonize the other, they don't celebrate barbarity, they don't intimidate, they don't harass, and they don't find pleasure or comfort in violence. And they are against all forms of hatred. So we're beginning now to operationalize that respectful dialogue, and I think you'll hear about it in the days that come, because for me, I'm very concerned about the indoctrination that's going on our campuses. I'm very concerned about the inability, for example, of the Jewish students' voices who I speak with regularly to present themselves as Jews, to express a viewpoint that is pro-Israel, or express whatever the view they want to express in relation to the state of Israel, Zionism, and being Zionists. And that indoctrination has caused me to believe that one of the remedies in very difficult times, and indeed in campuses that are toxic at times, is having conferences where people are talking to people about the issues in a respectful way. And so I've enlisted the support of the Shalom Hartman Institute. Many of you will be familiar with it. It brings together scholars, both Israeli and Palestinian, who speak to each other, don't demonize each other, but have meaningful conversations that are constructive and built towards solutions rather than building this toxicity and building continued hatred. And what we hope to do is follow a series of conferences right across the country with working groups that involve students from a variety of perspectives who will talk to each other, because it's not happening on most of our campuses right now. And for me, the war can end in Israel and in Lebanon, but nonetheless, the war will not end on our campuses and on our streets until we have that kind of respectful dialogue. At the same time, what I saw happening in Canada was that Jewish organizations that were attempting to address anti-Semitism were operating in silos. And now I've seen this for 40 years in my work on anti-Semitism. And I confess, and I was a member of one of the major Jewish organizations in this country. And I found nonetheless that when it came to fighting anti-Semitism, there was too much concern about who gets credit or whose initiative is this, instead of how do we work together to address the issues that face the community. So I formed a coalition, Lisa made reference to it, the Alliance of Canadians Combating Anti-Semitism. We have 41 community organizations that are now participants. It was an important part of this initiative for me that we were drawing not only upon the Jewish community, but the often overlooked non-Jewish community that has been rallying, and not as much as I'd like, but rallying to the support of the Jewish community. So we have the Council of Muslims Against Anti-Semitism, we have a Catholic organization, we have Indigenous leadership, we have Iranian leadership, and I could go on and on. We have educators, we have teachers, we have doctors, we have dentists, we have lawyers, we have Honest Reporting, we have Stand With Us. We have many of the organizations that will be familiar to you, but the idea behind the organization was that we would build on the work of each other. It wouldn't be about who gets the credit, it would be about getting the job done. This shouldn't be such a novel proposition, but nonetheless, we're only going to succeed in and on behalf of the Jewish community if we form those kinds of alliances and we work in collaboration, and we're less concerned about which donate button is pressed and who gets the credit, as opposed to getting the job done. So that was the thinking behind it. So we've been involved in a number of initiatives. I'm happy in answering questions to describe some of them, but I want to give you an example of some of the things that would otherwise be unheard if it weren't for this alliance and the thought behind it. Because when I see, for example, encampments on university campuses, and I see some of the people on the encampments purport to speak for the Canadian Indigenous community and say that Israel is a colonizer as opposed to the colonized, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this, a very different perspective exists in the Indigenous community that had to be heard. So, for example, we had Harry Laforme, the first Indigenous appellate judge in Canada, go to speak at York University, where he was receiving an award, and he said, "Stop misrepresenting the Canadian Indigenous experience to justify anti-Semitism. Cut it out. You don't know our experience, and you're misusing our experience." And as a result of his efforts, the Mississaugas, whose traditional lands are where many of the encampments took place, came out with a statement from the Grand Chief and the band that said this to the university presidents: "These are our traditional lands. We expect you to take into account our wishes when you are dealing with our traditional lands." So this is consistent with the accommodation that is expected of the Indigenous community. And you didn't consult us about the use of these lands, which in our view are contrary to the basic principles of Canadian indigeneity. We support our Jewish community in its time of need, and we support Zionism as an Indigenous movement. And for those of you who don't know, there's actually an Indigenous embassy in Jerusalem. But probably none of you know this until I tell you this now. There is an embassy that is devoted to Indigenous peoples around the world. that have their embassy in Jerusalem, and the position they take is that Israel is the most successful decolonization movement, indigenous movement, that has existed in the world. Now, some of you may disagree with that. Some of you may characterize Israel in a different way. But for me, what a powerful voice, what powerful voices that otherwise aren't being heard in mainstream media or in social media. So for me, these were important messages to communicate. Now, what's different about what we're experiencing now in the aftermath of October the 7th of last year than we've experienced in the past? Because I, for one, have dealt with anti-Semitism since 1980. My wife saw graffiti, neo-Nazi graffiti, on a building near where she worked as a lawyer. She called at the time B'nai B'rith to report it. They said, well, you know, it's interesting that you're calling as a lawyer because we really need someone to help us out on some of the legal issues. So she volunteered me. Very, very typical of her. And I love her dearly. And as a result, that became a work that was central to my life. And I focused particularly on hate crimes, hate-motivated crimes, because as you've heard, I'm a criminal lawyer by trade. And I should say, usually, Lisa introduced me as a criminal lawyer. Usually, I prefer to say I'm a lawyer practicing criminal law. I defend criminal lawyers. But I'll leave aside that distinction, and I have focused on hate crimes. It's a big part of my focus because I am a believer, and I've debated on lots of occasions, including my dear friend, the late Alan Borovoy, what should be a crime and what should not be a crime. When does hate speech become criminal speech and when should it not? And we had lively debates and lively discussions. But for me, this is an important feature here because what we are seeing now is we are seeing the prevalence of extremism on our campuses, on our streets, and in the narratives that are taking place. And again, I want to be very clear about something because I have said this so many times. I'm really tired of being accused. I know how the innocent feel now being accused wrongly of this myself. I'm tired of hearing that I'm trying to suppress criticism of Israel. I described myself for years as a member and a proud member of the progressive left. I've been proud to work on anti-Black racism. I've been proud to work on LGBTQ issues and testified before parliamentary committees to make sure that sexual orientation was dealt with when the motive of a crime was sexual orientation or gender identity, that it was dealt with as a hate crime. Wasn't always thus. I've dealt with sexism. I've dealt with the traditional issues that the progressive left are engaged in. So I've also brought with that a very healthy criticism at times of Israel, of its policies, of some of its governments, of the far-right elements of the current government, of the settler movement. I am not at all sheltering Israel or criticism of Israel in my approach as a member of the progressive left. But two things have happened. The first is that after October the 7th, I expected that the honeymoon with Israel, the goodwill that was demonstrated towards Israel in the aftermath of the October 7th, would only probably last a week. But I never expected, and I admit this to you, I never expected to see the celebration of barbarity in the way that we have seen on our streets. I expected to hear the justifications, the excuses for what Hamas committed on October the 7th, I never thought that I would see people chanting in the streets that they celebrated what Hamas did. I never thought that I would hear people saying, "Make me proud, Houthis," knowing as I do what the Houthis that are involved in this conflict do to their women and their children. I never expected for people to be saying, "Make me proud, Iran," in the aftermath of Iran's tyrannical regime and treatment of women and so many others. That was a great surprise to me. And what I have seen is that the progressive left, with all due respect to those who may differ, has been hijacked. I don't describe myself as a progressive left member anymore, even though I hold all the same views that I held prior to October the 7th. Because for me, the progressive left is now a term that is used to describe those who have attempted to radicalize and indoctrinate and not allow competing views to be heard on our campuses. And for me, that's the real problem that I see. And we should have seen it coming. We were too complacent. We thought we had our place in Canadian society. We thought that anti-Semitism exists, but who would ever expect that it would be as overt as what we see now? So when I look at people chanting in the street, and I hear that they say, "I'm not anti-Semitic," and some of them believe this, "I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist." When anti-Zionism means, to me, simply the acknowledgement of the right of Jews to have a homeland in the land of Israel. You can disagree on how it's implemented in practice. You can disagree on how the West Bank is being dealt with. You can disagree with how the war is conducted in Gaza. That's not only okay with me, but I have discussions with people about these very, very issues. But what we've seen now, we're now back to the stage that I saw in 1975 as a youngster, when the motion was passed by the United Nations that said, "Zionism is racism." I see a return to those days. It's no longer an argument about whether Israel is abusing its powers, whether Israel is appropriately dealing with the occupied territories post-1967. Israel's very legitimacy as a state is front and center in the attack that's taking place on campuses and on our streets. So when I hear someone chant, "From the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free," I hear that there are benign explanations for that some people only mean by that there should be equality between Palestinians and Jews in the land of Israel. I hope people mean that when they say it. But I also attend rallies when I've heard the Arabic version chanted at the same time, "From river to river, Palestine shall be Arab," and there's no equivocation about what those things can mean. And we're still, for those of you who don't agree with my view about these things, ask yourself this question, and that is, if you know, and there's no one who doesn't know this, if you know that the Jewish community regards "From the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free" as a call for the genocide of the Jewish people, and you are legitimately interested in peace in the Middle East, why would you use a phrase that you know has that impact upon the Jewish community? How are you advancing the cause for peace in the Middle East? By deliberately adopting the language of genocidal killers such as Hamas. Why would you talk about global intifada knowing that the only experience that Israel has had with intifadas is an experience that is entirely rooted in violence against civilians? Why would you use those expressions? Why would you say, by any means necessary, with a picture of a machine gun, with Samadoun under the banner, if you're legitimately interested, as we all should be, in a way to reconcile competing interests and self-determination in a land that's so troubled? And by the way, nothing I say as a Zionist, and I'm a proud Zionist, I'm not embarrassed to say I'm a Zionist, I'm not embarrassed to show the manifestations of my Jewishness or my Zionism, none of that is inconsistent with believing in the rights of Palestinian self-determination. There's nothing inconsistent with believing in a two-state solution if ever the circumstances would present themselves again for that possibility to take place. So I have to ask people to stop demonizing the term. Stop redefining in a way that makes 91% of Jews racist, evil, and genocidal. Because what else does it mean when you're going down the street chanting, all Zionists are evil, all Zionists are genocidal, all Zionists are racist, knowing that 91% of our population believe in the existence of a homeland for the Jewish community in Israel? What are you saying? How is it any different than saying that the vast majority of Jews are racist, evil, and genocidal? How are you advancing the solutions rather than making campuses and our streets toxic? So how do we address these issues? Sometimes they seem overwhelming, don't they? And for me, the answer is multifaceted. The first is, you've heard, not everybody agrees with me, you've heard that I believe in the use of the criminal law to address the most extreme elements, the jihadist elements, those who have no interest in anything other than the destruction not only of the Jewish state, but the destruction of Western society as we know it. So the police are doing an uneven job in applying the criminal law. I've begun to engage in training to try to address, not to indoctrinate them to a particular view, political view on the Middle East. That's exactly what I'm opposed to, the indoctrination on political views, but instead to alert themselves to the measures that they actually do have in the law to address lawlessness, to address safety of our community. And for me, that's an important theme, lawlessness, because politicians have to understand that this isn't about counting Muslims and counting Jews and asking who's got more voting power. It's about addressing lawlessness. It's about addressing safety. It's about addressing security. It's about addressing Canadian values. The second thing that I think is important is strategic litigation. So I'm working on strategic litigation in the public interest of the Jewish community to address all the kinds of issues that I've identified. The third thing that I'm dealing with is respectful dialogue, and I've told you a little bit about this. And not everybody in the Jewish community is all that interested. I'll be frank, not everybody's interested in talking right now. You know, I've heard from a few people in the Jewish community that said, you know, now's not the time. Things are too toxic. Now's not the time to reach out to people who have disagreeing views with ours. Now's precisely the time when we're at our most toxic point to have those difficult conversations, because I don't like the alternative. And I would hope that you agree. And fourth, education. Education. Because again, in my view, within the spectrum of respectful dialogue, there's lots of room for divergent views. I'm sure there's lots of divergent views in this room or over the Zoom. Absolutely, 100%. But we can't have the kind of misinformation and distortion and one-sidedness that we see in the non-dialogue that's taking place on our campuses. We can't. I've seen too many instances where faculty members will only take one answer for the correct answer and leave no space for a student to express what is perceived to be a pro-Zionist view in his or her classroom. When a professor says there will be no Zionists in my class, that is saying that 91% of Jews are not welcome in that class. That's discriminatory, that is racist, and that disqualifies, in my view, that professor from teaching, because teachers are entitled to their views like anybody else. They're not entitled to create a poisoned environment for their students. And we established that back in the 80s. Some of you will remember Malcolm Ross, the New Brunswick teacher, who was a Holocaust denier. He didn't even teach Holocaust denial in his class, but he was very public about his Holocaust denialism. And the Supreme Court of Canada ultimately upheld the view that he could be terminated as a teacher because his involvement as a teacher poisoned the environment for Jewish and non-Jewish students who were attending his classes. But we have a more difficult problem today than we did back when I was dealing with neo-Nazis. The more difficult problem is we recognize the illegitimacy of neo-Nazis back in the 80s. They never did gain mainstream acceptance. Now we have this patina of legitimacy around those who are preaching the message that I have talked to you about, the odious message that I've talked about. There's a sense of legitimacy because it comes from scholars. It comes from those who are supposedly learned. It comes from a non-nuanced theory that everyone in the world is divided into either colonizers or colonized. And it's based on so much misinformation. So to give you about one example, I listened to a Palestinian woman say, "No wonder they treat us this badly. We are people of color. They are white and blonde." So what do you say other than the fact that almost 50% of Israel's population are now people of color? What do you say to people who think that Israel is composed entirely of Jews, not knowing that 21% of its population are Arab, not knowing that 21% of its university students are Arab, not knowing that Arabs form political parties, that Arabs sit on the Supreme Court of Israel, that Arabs serve in the military? So I welcome the heartiest, most robust criticism of Israel that anyone can muster. A lot of it comes from Israelis. But this demonization and delegitimization of the state as a state solves nothing and unfortunately speaks of an underlying anti-Semitism in effect, whatever the person thinks the intent is. So I had prepared some comments, as you've seen. I really haven't looked at what I prepared because I'm a little bit passionate about the topic, as you can see. But I did find something today that I wanted to read to you, because even though we are feeling anti-Semitism in a way that's very different than the diaspora has ever felt it, so many people in our community feel it now as an existential risk to us, not just to Israel. And I hearken back to something that Yossi Halevi Klein said in a meeting that I attended, he said, the most dangerous place for Jews in the world right now, physically, is Israel. The most psychologically safe place for Jews in the world right now is Israel. That's a very, very different perspective than we've ever experienced. Certainly in my lives, certainly in most of your lives. So something is very different. At the same time, something is very much the same. Let me read you, and I'll conclude on this, let me read you what the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations said in 1975 during the debate on the resolution that Zionism is racism. And for those of you who don't know the history, that resolution was passed and later repealed in 1991. But this is what he said at the time. And I'm going to ask you to listen to the words and ask yourself, would one single word be changed if this speech were given to the United Nations today? This is what he said. The great moments of Jewish history come to mind as I face you. Once again, outnumbered and the would-be victim of hate, ignorance, and evil. I look back on those great moments. I recall the greatness of a nation which I have the honor to represent in this forum. I am mindful at this moment of the Jewish people throughout the world, wherever they may be it in freedom or in slavery, whose prayers and thoughts are with me at this moment. I stand here not as a supplicant. Vote as your moral conscience dictates to you, for the issue is neither Israel nor Zionism. The issue is the continued existence of this organization, which has been dragged to its lowest point of discredit by a coalition of despots and racists. The vote of each delegation will record in history its country's stand on anti-Semitic racism and anti-Judaism. You yourself bear the responsibility for your stand before history, for as such will you be viewed in history. We, the Jewish people, will not forget. Would you say a single word differently when you look at how the UN has addressed the issue today? I say not. So, having thrown away all my notes, having told you about nothing that I prepared to talk to you about, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Oh, hi. I do ask you to put your hand up and use the microphone if you have questions. For Zoom attendees, this is not an interactive session, so I'm sorry you don't have the opportunity to ask questions, but please, we have to use the mic so that the people on Zoom are able to hear.
Thank you for that talk, and very interesting, fascinating. There was something that came out in the news, probably within the last week, a movement between, or a dialogue between Ehud Olmert and his Palestinian counterpart. I can't remember whether he was the Minister of Finance or he was somebody ministerial in the Palestinian government, with a new peace proposal that they're trying to put together. Can you comment on that?
I'm not familiar what the terms of the proposal are. I did hear something along those lines, and obviously all I can say is that when you're talking about peace proposals, I think everything can be on the table and one can have informed conversations. And Olmert, notwithstanding the fact that he was politically to the right, to say the least, and at times I regarded him as right of Attila the Hun at times, he was the author of what was regarded as a very generous peace proposal back when that ultimately did not succeed. So any efforts that are being made, I don't know the details of what's being proposed, but any efforts that are being made certainly would be welcome from my perspective. I'm not really helping you terribly much on it, though. So
thank you very much for all that you do in this regard. Something about intercommunity. You had mentioned near the beginning about the indigenous community being supportive. And I would imagine...
Some.
Yeah, some, of course. Every place, every group is a spectrum. But I would imagine that a lot of the support that you had mentioned for Israel, for Jews, could be the result of work done by Bernie Farber with the Canadian Jewish Congress, where he put a lot of time into bringing indigenous groups to Israel, for instance, and working with the leadership, and not just of indigenous groups, but other groups, Muslim groups, etc.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if nowadays, because the CJC is basically defunct, CJA has become the dominating or dominant organization in that regard. Is there that sort of operation? Also, back a couple of decades ago, at the beginning of the Second Intifada, I was active in Canadian Friends of Peace Now, and we had been working with the Palestine House in Mississauga,
right,
and doing some joint efforts, and we had good relations back then. But then soon thereafter, their leadership changed. You know, they were taken over basically by pro-Hamas, and we were no longer able to do things together with them. So what is going on nowadays with CJA and other organizations?
Yeah, I'm not going to speak to CJA per se, even though CJA, by the way, is one of the members of our coalition. But there are several groups that continue to be involved in taking non-Jews to Israel. And as a matter of fact, one of our most outspoken Zionists within our organization, Michael Osborne, has created a Catholic organization called Bring Love to educate people about Israel. And he was inspired by this by being taken on a trip to Israel, an organized trip that non-Jews were taken to. So some of the organizations within our alliance are continuing to do that. I'd like to see more and more of it taking place because for me, there's no better proof than actually taking people to Israel and getting to see the nuance, the difficulty, the challenges, and the good faith that also exists. And I'm going to make one comment that digresses from that a little bit. And I should have said this as well. We just had a meeting of our Respectful Dialogue Committee, and that is populated by a number of people who you'd know. Like if I sat down with you and kind of talked to you about who's on it, these are people who have been doing that kind of work for 40 years. I was involved with one of them on Sikh-Jewish, Muslim-Jewish, and Black-Jewish dialogue in the 1980s. And these people are still committed to these dialogues, still committed to bringing people to Israel, but also having conversations here. And I've been very impressed by the Hartman Institute because they're very much committed to this as well. So that would be my answer. The work's going on. There can never be too much of it as far as I'm concerned. Right. Yes.
First of all, thank you, Mr. Sandler, for all the good work you do. It's very inspirational. It really is.
Thank you. Call me Mark, please.
Mark, I have two questions if you have time for the second one.
Okay.
But could you explain to us why it's so difficult to get a conviction under whatever that section is of the code for hate crimes?
Right.
You know, and should I ask the second one now or wait till...
Let me answer that first because I have short-term memory loss. So the answer is, so the question was, why is it so difficult to get a conviction on the section that's most often cited, willful promotion of hatred? So willful promotion of hatred is a section of the criminal code that requires not only hatred directed against an identifiable group, in this instance Jews or Israelis, both of whom qualify as identifiable group, but it has to come with the highest form of guilty intent. It's called willfulness, which means you're not only engaging in language that has the effect of promoting hatred against a group, you have to be doing it for that purpose. You have to be motivated for that purpose. But I actually do not think that the impediments are as great as they have been represented to be. Because in my view, like when I go to the police, I'm a criminal complainant in some cases that are currently being investigated. And when I go to them with cases where the circumstantial evidence is such that the only reasonable inference that can be drawn is that it's a willful promotion of hatred. So for example, if people are marching down the street, and I mentioned this before, and they say, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. Okay, I understand judges may say, you know, that's subject to a variety of interpretations. Some judges have said that and so on. But when it's combined with two things, and this is one of the cases that I'm aware of, when it's combined with a chant that says, from river to river, Palestine shall be Arab, and it's combined with a responsive chant that says, Sinwar, Sinwar, we have bullets for you. Okay, is somebody going to seriously tell me that the combination of those facts don't give rise to a willful promotion of hatred? So I don't think it's as hard as it has been represented to be. I think police need better education on it, but I also think there has to be the political will to lay the charges. And the police are not supposed to be governed by politics. But by the same time, you know, when they report to a board, and the board is a function of a city council, you want to know that you're operating within an environment where there's zero tolerance for hatred. And I don't believe that environment exists, for example, in Toronto yet. I think we're a long way away. And the second point that I'd make, and I make this in training exercises, is that everybody focuses on that willful promotion of hatred section. There are lots of other offenses that exist that could be utilized to address these issues. So I'll give you an example. The police in Toronto have never laid a charge since October 7th of intimidation under the criminal code. Intimidation is a specific section that is intended to address the blockage of roads, any roads where vehicular traffic takes place, tunnels or bridges, with the intent to compel someone either to do something they don't have to do or not do something that they want to do. The intimidation section fits perfectly a number of scenarios, doesn't require the personal consent of the Attorney General, like the willful promotion of hatred section. So part of it is understanding what tools you have available and not simply relying upon the willful promotion of hatred. Mischief is another example. Everybody thinks about mischief. If you break someone's window or you break a shul's window, that's a mischief, damage to property. Mischief is also the interference with the lawful use and enjoyment of property by others, which frankly applies to a number of situations that we've seen in protests, excluding Jews from public spaces where protests are taking place, is a mischief. It's an interference with the lawful use and enjoyment of that property by others who are entitled to participate in that space, and it applies whether it's privately owned space or publicly owned space. We've got lawyers here, very eminent lawyers here. They can tell me when I'm wrong, but I'm not. And what I'm saying is that there are tools available. It's not such a big impediment as it has been presented to be. Your second question?
Before I give you your second question, can I see a show of hands? Oh, there's quite a few. I will come back to you. Okay, so I saw Michael, then I'll come to you, Julie.
It's like Phil Donahue.
Thank you. My name is Michael Wharton. I'd like to speak about a confounding issue with regard to anti-Semitism and with regard to intimidation of Jewish communities. A recent article, I think it was Toronto Star, described a number of situations, the bridge situation and so on, that appeared to be attempts to intimidate Jews. But the counter-argument was that some of the people doing the intimidating were Jews, and therefore it couldn't be an anti-Semitic activity. So I've seen this for quite a long time, that as long as Jews are doing it, amongst others, then it can't be anti-Semitic. So really none of it is anti-Semitic, because some of the people doing it are also Jews. So this is, in my mind, and it convinced the writer of this article in the Star that it was a winning argument. For sure, none of those intimidations were anti-Semitic. How would you respond?
Okay. Well, first of all, sometimes I think that we are too preoccupied. Having spent the better part of an hour talking to you about anti-Semitism, sometimes I think that we spend a little bit too much time parsing whether the activity amounts to anti-Semitism either in intent or effect. Because for me, if you're engaged in intimidation of a Jewish community by deliberately engaging in certain kind of activity designed to be located in a place where you are putting at risk the safety or the safety concerns of the people there, you don't get into an analysis of whether it's anti-Semitic or not. It's intimidation. Intimidation doesn't require a proof of an intent to be anti-Semitic. So for me, sometimes I think we spend a little bit too much time thinking about whether the conduct amounts to intentional anti-Semitism or anti-Semitism in effect. I have my own views on it. I have also my own views on whether it's really legitimate to say that because Jews are participating in it necessarily is immunized from a finding of anti-Semitism. I don't believe that either. I don't think that's the case. But what I'm really saying to you is that when I'm dealing with these things at a legal level, I say, all very interesting, but let's look at the conduct that's involved and whether it amounts to an offense or whether it amounts to actionable conduct, instead of kind of parsing whether their participation elevates it to anti-Semitism or not. And by the way, for every act that has taken place in this city, there will be a member of the Jewish community. I mean, Breen said that it amounts to about 3% of the Jewish population in Canada that is anti-Zionist. There will be somebody in the Jewish community that will support the position taken. That doesn't mean that you throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, if one Jew or 10 Jews or what have you support what is otherwise anti-Semitic conduct, it loses its character as such. So that would be my answer. And I should also say one other thing. So at TMU, when 77 students at that law school issued a letter that, in my view, was anti-Semitic, that demonized the state of Israel and its very legitimacy, as opposed to engage in a critical analysis of Israel, that said some incredibly painful things, the former judge who wrote a report on it said that he wasn't persuaded that the intent of the students was anti-Semitic. And the law is crystal clear on that. And that is, you look at the nature of the statements made and whether their effect is anti-Semitic. You don't start parsing whether their intention is anti-Semitic. So he got it dead wrong. Leave aside the fact that he never even figured out who authored the letter, so how could he even speak to the question as to whether it was intended to be anti-Semitic? But he overruled with a single stroke of the pen at least 50 years of jurisprudence that said, under dealing with non-criminal human rights complaints, the intention to be anti-Semitic does not decide the issue. So anyway, I hope that's not an overly legalistic answer to a good question.
Thank you, Mark. My name is Julie. I'm going back to the hate crime question. So I understand about chanting, and yelling at each other across a bridge. But what about shooting a girls' Jewish school? What's the threshold of evidence or intent when in the middle of the night, and it happened twice, one in
Right.
May and one, I mean, I'm not sure, and the police, we heard on the news this weekend, oh, they're considering whether it's a hate crime. They shot at a Jewish girls' school. I mean, thank God nobody was in there.
So I must confess, because I'm candid if nothing else, I was kind of surprised at the statement from the police because the circumstantial evidence, in my view, pointed pretty strongly to the fact that people aren't shooting up a Jewish school at night for their health or as target practice, that it's likely motivated by hate. But that's just showing a little bit of ultra-conservatism, because in the ordinary course, when you arrest someone, you do see these incidents occur in a non-hate environment. You see people doing stupid things, right? So they're being hyper cautious, and they also, before they proceed on a hate-motivated crime, they need to refer it to the hate crime unit so that the hate crime unit makes the determination. But I'm pretty satisfied that that will turn out to be a hate-motivated crime.
Okay, so I think we will maybe do 3 more questions, if that's okay. If there is a hue and cry, I'll ask one of the judges in the room to help me determine.
There's a few.
Yeah, Michael Mitchell, hi. You spoke about strategic litigation being one of the points that your group is focusing on, but you really didn't say much more about it. But you raised this question, or you raised what occurred at TMU, where the Nova Scotia judge wrote a pretty inappropriate decision. The same thing essentially happened on the encampment case, where, you know, I guess in my own view, CJA and I think it was CJA and I think B'nai B'rith intervened on that case in order to try to accomplish within the boundaries of that case some of the goals that you sort of talked about here with the phraseology of the demonstrators, and fell very badly flat on their face in front of that particular judge in a very unfortunate judgment, which is probably going to be referenced across Canada. I'm also wondering, in the labor arena, the employment arena, the case before the Human Rights Commission, the most recent case being taken with OPSU, where we have some pretty relatively inexperienced people acting for the complainants, and I'm not sure on what basis. So it's sort of worrisome to have strategic litigation only to have it, blow up in your face. So I just wonder if you could comment.
Sure, I could comment on that for an hour. So I'm going to do the short form version of it. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, after a prolonged encampment at the University of Toronto, the University of Toronto sought an injunction to remove the encampment. The application was successful, but the judge's reasons, in my view, were problematic. And what should have happened in that case is the University of Toronto's strongest argument was that they are trespassing and that the University of Toronto has the right, as the owners and occupiers of the property, to determine what can and cannot be done on its property. End of story. There was an overwhelming case in support of that position. And because that was its primary argument, it was only its secondary argument to say that basically the people who were involved in the encampment were engaged in anti-Semitic activity, poisoning the environment at the University of Toronto. And the interveners, in other words, other people who wanted to have their say, including some of the Jewish organizations and some of the counter-organizations, were not allowed to lead affirmative evidence about all the things that were going on. So I knew a hell of a lot more about what was going on there than the court ever heard. And I thought it was unfortunate because the primary focus was on trespass and only the secondary focus was on the nature of the activity, that you had a judge who decided, okay, I could decide this in one paragraph, But because all of you people have come and shown up, I'm going to now talk for 40 pages about stuff that ultimately is called obiter in law, which means unnecessary to my decision. It's a very unwise thing for judges to engage in controversial issues on giving obiter, their aside views on matters, knowing that these issues are going to rise time and time again, because that judgment is going to be misused. I'm writing a critical analysis of the judgment. You'll see it if you go to our website, which I'm going to plug before I leave, and because that's what you do when you speak, you plug a product. So I'm going to plug a product before I leave. But that was the problem. The problem is the judge took it on himself to express opinions on matters unnecessary to his decision. He didn't have the full evidentiary record, but there are other problems that were exposed there, because what he said was that the basis for his decision, the obiter part of his decision, was that the actual people who are named in the court motion, the actual people who came forward and said, I was in the encampment, I was an occupier, they could not have been, they were not proven to be the ones that said all of the anti-Semitic things that were said. The judge acknowledged that there was all this anti-Semitic stuff that was being said around the encampment, but couldn't prove, it hadn't been proven that it was these particular people that had said them. And my view as a matter of law was that was completely irrelevant. It was completely irrelevant whether you could put those words in the mouths of those specific people, as opposed to talking about what the encampment was causing on the university environment. So the answer to the second part of your question is, when I talk about strategic litigation, I'm talking about, and I'm not rolling it out tonight, but one of the things that we have been seeing is kind of haphazard litigation. It's kind of responsive to specific issues, and there's no organization to who responds, in what jurisdiction, who acts on their behalf, and so on. And I think you're going to see a much more organized approach that I'm trying to encourage with all of the organizations that are involved in this space, which will involve a litigation fund at a national level that will identify the cases of particular importance and ensure that the very best lawyers are handling them. That's what I see as the model for strategic litigation.
Well, I'm ready to write my LSATs. Anyone else? I see Sharna. I saw a couple of other. James, I see you. Okay, last two then. And I hope that Mark will be available to answer questions individually after.
Hi, this is going to take the conversation perhaps in a slightly different direction. So if you don't think it's appropriate, then please let me know. I'm asking this for my own benefit, because I've had difficult conversations with people personally, but I also hopefully for the benefit of our community. And it addresses the other foci of your organization, which I believe you mentioned, which was promoting respectful dialogue with people who have opposing views. And so I'm just kind of wondering if you could comment from your own personal experience, having had those conversations, and also maybe just give us a little bit of a kind of respectful dialogue 101, some pointers that could be helpful to us personally and as a community.
Okay. Boy, that's a big order. I'm actually doing a presentation in the near future on what respectful dialogue means and how you go about it. So I don't think I can do that in a couple of minutes, but I think I'll just say this, that there's no doubt that there are people whose views are so extreme that there cannot be a constructive dialogue. I'm not naive about these things. You know, I do understand when we set our parameters for our national dialogue, we set out some ground rules. And the ground rules were around, you know, people do not participate in this dialogue if they celebrate or incite violence, the usual things that you would think around that space. So you have to start with a space that you have to have someone to talk to who's prepared to listen, who's prepared to engage in what is known by psychologists as active listening, actually hearing what the other person says, thinking about what they say, and respond to it. So I was asked for one particular profession to do their anti-Semitism training, and I knew that in that profession there are a wide range of views, pro-Zionist, anti-Zionist, they'd characterize as pro-Palestinian, and that's a whole, even the nomenclature raises all those kinds of issues, but a wide range of views. And I said, I'm not going to do anti-Semitism training without preceding it with respectful dialogue training. Because if I just go cold into, this is what I think anti-Semitism is all about, and this is what I think of the IRA definition, and so on and so forth, people won't be listening. People will tune out. So I start with a discussion about what respectful dialogue means, and I do give examples of what that dialogue entails and where the limits are drawn. And I don't know that I can elaborate on it much in this environment, except to say that that's where I always start the conversation. I always start with ensuring that the people who are participating basically adhere to some pretty fundamental rules, and second of all, that they're prepared to at least listen. And I also think that it's very important when we're doing our respectful dialogues at campuses, they can't be sponsored, and this isn't a criticism of the major Jewish organizations. They can't be sponsored. It can't be UJA holds respectful dialogue, because we need to bring people to the discussion who otherwise won't show up. And so we really have to ensure that even the way the respectful dialogue is labeled is such that they know it's not an indoctrination exercise, it's an exercise to listen, right? And so we're not there just, I mean, I have very strong views, as you know, about Israel, not just there to promote my views on Israel, it's to engage in a dialogue, because as long as people are talking and not demonizing each other, then we're making some progress. I'm sorry I can't elaborate on it. You may have to sign up for the course.
I think actually that was an excellent question to end the evening on. James has deferred for now, and unless there is someone with one last burning question, I'm going to call it an evening for us. And Mark, what's the URL?
So I will ask within the synagogue to please distribute this. Our website is www.alcca.ca. So the AL is for the Alliance, the CC is Canadians Combating, and the A is Anti-Semitism. But I'm hoping you'll put it out there so for people who don't remember. We put out a newsletter once a week. It includes calls to action. And I try to engage, and others engage, in critical analysis that you won't read anywhere else. So we try to be fresh and refreshing and interesting and different. They're more detailed than you'll see. Like, I don't believe in kind of these social media, like one paragraph blurbs or everything in capital print with exclamation marks. I like to engage in some critical analysis. And the call to action for this week, if those people go on the newsletter that was issued today, has to do with the University of Windsor agreement that was entered into with the occupiers and the Student Alliance there, and all the problems that we see with that agreement having been entered into. But every week there's something different.
Mark, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. Thank you to all of you on Zoom, to everybody in the room. This was a different kind of conversation and discussion. And I'm very proud of us for beginning these kinds of talks. Whether you agree or you disagree, this is one evening. There are more to come, And it's important for us as a community and as a congregation to be part of the rest of the community and talking and thinking and learning and listening. So thank you all for being here tonight. I wish I could offer you cake and cookies and tea and coffee, but this is bare bones. Thank you for your time, and we have many more things coming up in terms of many more holidays in the next little while. So we hope to see you again soon. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Mark.